The year was 1879, and the autumn was dying a slow, hard death across the high plains. For Ezra Blackwood, it felt like a mirror to his own soul. The land around his small, isolated homestead was leached of color, the grasses brittle and bleached to the color of old bone under a sky that was a vast, indifferent sheet of gray. Each morning he rose before the sun had summoned the courage to breach the horizon, and the cold was a physical thing that seeped through the chinked logs of his cabin and settled deep into his marrow. It was a cold that had lived inside him for more than a year now, ever since the fever had come and taken everything that mattered. He moved through his days with the mechanical precision of a man running on memory alone. The swing of the axe as it bit into pine logs was a familiar rhythm, the shudder in his arms, a known sensation. He mended the fences that defined the edges of his world, his fingers, raw and chapped, working the wire with a practiced numbness. He tended to his 2 gaunt cows and half-dozen chickens, their small noises the only answer to the oppressive silence that had claimed the property as its own. This place, once vibrant with the laughter of his wife Abigail and the shouting games of their son, Samuel, was now just a collection of buildings held together by duty and haunted by echoes. The cabin itself was the heart of the emptiness. It was too large for one man. Abigail's rocking chair still sat by the hearth, its wood smooth and dark from her touch, but it never moved. Samuel's small, whittled bird, a lopsided thing with a perpetually surprised expression, remained on the mantelpiece, a sentinel of a life that had been stolen. Ezra found his gaze skittering away from these objects, his mind shying from the memories they held like a horse from a flame. The grief was not a sharp, fresh wound anymore. It had become a landscape, the very ground on which he walked, vast and unchangeable. Outside, on a small rise overlooking the unforgiving plains, were 2 wooden crosses. He had carved their names himself, his hands shaking so badly the letters were almost illegible. He did not go there. He could not. Isolation had become his shield. The nearest town was a full day's ride, and he made the journey only when supplies ran so low that necessity overrode his profound disinterest in the world of men. He had listened to the talk in the general store, the fearful, hateful words spit like tobacco juice about the Cheyenne, whose lands this had once been. They were called savages, specters that haunted the edges of civilization. Ezra had absorbed this prejudice without question, the way a man absorbs the chill of the air. It was a distant fear, an abstraction, for he had never encountered any of the local tribes. He preferred it that way. He wanted nothing from the world, and he wanted the world to ask nothing of him. He was a man whittled down to the core, living a life of quiet resignation, waiting for a winter that he suspected might finally claim him as it had claimed his family. Then the sky turned. The indifferent gray thickened and curdled into a bruised purple-black that swallowed the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant mournful sigh, began to shriek. It was not a normal storm. This was a monster, a white beast of legend that descended from the mountains with a sudden, shocking ferocity. The air filled with a blinding torrent of snow, driven horizontally by the gale. It was a physical assault, erasing the world, burying the familiar lines of his fences and barn under a churning sea of white. Ezra was fighting his way back from the barn, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs when he saw it. Through the maelstrom, a shape, dark and unsteady, stumbled against the storm's fury. It was a human figure, staggering, falling, rising again, a desperate, losing battle against the elements. It reached his fence line, a mere 50 yards from the cabin, and then collapsed into a heap, disappearing almost instantly into a fresh drift. His first instinct was a cold knot of fear and suspicion. In this land, a stranger was more often a threat than a godsend. It could be a thief, a desperado, someone drawn by the lonely plume of smoke from his chimney. The part of him that had grown hard and insular screamed to bar the door, to let the storm have whomever it was. It was not his concern. He had learned the cruel lesson that survival was a solitary affair. But then, an image of Abigail's face, her expression of deep, unwavering compassion, flickered in his mind. He saw Samuel, small and helpless in his final hours. He cursed under his breath, the words stolen by the wind. He could not leave a man to die, not like this. It was a line he had not yet crossed. Wrapping his scarf tighter around his face, he leaned into the blizzard and forced his way toward the fallen shape. The snow was already waist-deep in the drifts, a thick, heavy powder that fought his every step. He found the man half buried, his face pressed into the snow. With numb fingers, Ezra brushed the snow away and turned him over. The man's face was stark and angular, his skin the color of burnished copper, his long black hair matted with ice. He was Cheyenne. His buckskin clothing was thin and offered little protection against such a gale. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, a faint wisp of vapor in the frigid air. There were no weapons visible, no rifle or bow. The storm had likely stripped them from him. He was just a man freezing to death at the edge of Ezra's world. With a grunt of exertion that was part physical effort and part groan of reluctant spirit, Ezra hoisted the man into a fireman's carry. The dead weight was immense, and Ezra's own body, weary from grief and meager rations, screamed in protest. He fought his way back to the cabin, step by agonizing step, the howling wind trying to rip the man from his shoulders. He kicked the door open and half fell inside, dropping his burden onto the rough-hewn floorboards before slamming the door shut, cutting off the shriek of the storm. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening, broken only by his own ragged gasps and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He had brought the wilderness inside. He had brought the unknown into the heart of his sanctuary of sorrow, and he had no idea if he had just saved a life or sealed his own fate. For a long moment, Ezra stood over the unconscious form, his breath clouding in the cold air of the cabin. The man was a specter from the stories in town, a living embodiment of the fear and mistrust he had passively accepted. Yet, on the floor, he looked only like a man defeated by the elements. His strength, whatever it might have been, was gone. He was vulnerable. With a sigh of resignation, Ezra dragged him closer to the fire, the heat drawing a faint steam from his frozen clothes. He worked with a grim, functional purpose, his movements detached. He pulled off the man's stiff, ice-encrusted moccasins, revealing feet that were a pale, alarming white. He chafed them gently with a coarse wool blanket, trying to bring life back into the frozen flesh, the entire time feeling a profound sense of unreality. He covered the man with every spare blanket he owned, piling them high, creating a cocoon of warmth. He did not know the man's name, his story, or his intent. He only knew the imperative of a human life flickering before him, and the ghost of his wife whispering that this was the right thing to do. The stranger remained unconscious through the rest of the day and into the night. The blizzard did not relent. It laid siege to the small cabin, rattling the window panes and piling snow against the walls with a relentless, soft pressure. Ezra sat in his chair, the rifle across his lap, and watched. He watched the slow rise and fall of the blankets, the gradual return of a healthier color to the man's exposed cheekbones. He did not sleep. He existed in a state of high alert, a guardian to a man who might be his enemy. Sometime in the gray hours before dawn, the man stirred. His eyes opened. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a deep, bottomless suspicion. He took in his surroundings in a single, sweeping glance: the log walls, the meager furnishings, the fire, and finally, Ezra. The warrior's instinct was plain to see, his body tensed, ready for a fight, even in its weakened state. Ezra held up a hand, palm open, a universal gesture he hoped would be understood. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, setting the rifle aside, but keeping it within reach. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken questions and primal caution. Neither man moved for a long time. They were two poles of a world that rarely met in peace, forced into a fragile truce by the howling fury of nature. Finally, Ezra rose and ladled some thin broth from the pot, simmering over the fire, into a bowl. He approached the man cautiously and offered it. The warrior's eyes narrowed, searching Ezra's face for any sign of treachery. After a long, tense moment, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Ezra helped him sit up, his back against a rolled-up blanket. The man took the bowl in unsteady hands and drank, the warm liquid a small miracle in the frozen world. He finished it and handed the bowl back, another curt nod his only thanks. And so their strange cohabitation began. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Silence was the third occupant of the room, heavy and watchful. They communicated through necessity, with gestures and glances. When Ezra needed more firewood from the pile inside, the man would shift his legs out of the way. When the man coughed, a dry, rattling sound, Ezra would offer him water. They were like 2 wary animals sharing a cave, aware of each other's every breath, every movement. Ezra found himself studying the man. He had a quiet dignity, a stillness that seemed at odds with the violent stories he'd heard. The man, in turn, watched Ezra with an unnerving intensity, his gaze missing nothing. The storm's relentless assault began to wear on Ezra, the confinement stirring the grief he tried so hard to keep buried. On the 3rd night, the wind howled with a particular human-like sorrow, and it found an echo in his own heart. He sat staring at the fire, his defenses crumbling, when his eyes fell upon the little whittled bird on the mantelpiece. He saw Samuel's small, earnest face, his tongue stuck out in concentration as he carved it. He saw Abigail smiling, her hands dusted with flour. The loss was suddenly as sharp and as cold as the blizzard outside. He did not realize he was crying, a single, silent tear tracking a path through the grime on his cheek, until he felt a presence beside him. The Cheyenne man had moved, with a quietness that was startling, to stand near his chair. He did not speak, he simply looked at the wooden bird, then back at Ezra's face. In his dark eyes there was not pity, but a flicker of profound, shared understanding. He reached out and placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. The touch was brief, firm, and astonishingly grounding. It was a gesture that transcended language and culture, a simple acknowledgement of pain, man to man, sufferer to sufferer. Then he withdrew his hand and returned to his place by the fire. The gesture broke something open in the silent cabin. The tension did not vanish, but it changed, softening at the edges. The next morning, Ezra found a tear in the man's buckskin tunic, near the shoulder. On impulse, he retrieved Abigail's sewing kit. He held up the needle and thread, a questioning look on his face. The man watched him for a moment, then nodded and slipped the tunic off, revealing a physique corded with muscle and laced with old scars. Ezra sat and stitched the garment, his fingers clumsy at first, but the simple, domestic act felt meaningful. It was an act of mending, not just for the cloth, but for something else, something intangible between them. When he was finished, he handed it back. The man examined the repair, then looked at Ezra and spoke for the first time. His voice was a low rasp. "Vokin." He touched his own chest. "Ezra," he replied, touching his own. A name. It was a fragile bridge, but it was a start. Later that day, Vokin, using a combination of gestures and a few more halting words, conveyed that he had been part of a hunting party, tracking buffalo. When the blizzard had struck and separated him from the others, he pointed to his heart, then drew 2 small figures in the air beside a larger one, a family. He, too, had something to lose. The following day, Vokin picked up a piece of firewood and, using a small, sharp stone he'd found by the hearth, began to carve. Ezra watched, fascinated, as a shape emerged from the wood under his skilled hands. His fingers, which Ezra had assumed were only for weapons or hard labor, moved with a surprising delicacy and grace. Over several hours, he carved a small, detailed figure of a wolf, its head raised as if howling at the moon. When he was done, he polished it smooth with ash and held it out to Ezra. It was a gift. A repayment for the mended tunic, for the broth, for a life. Ezra took it, the wood still warm in his hand. He placed it on the mantelpiece, next to Samuel's bird. The two carvings, one of a bird and one of a wolf, one made by a boy and one by a warrior, stood together in the firelight. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet, growing respect. On the fourth morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died, and an eerie, brilliant silence had fallen. Ezra opened the door to a landscape of impossible beauty and danger. The snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts, glittering under a sun that seemed shockingly bright in a clean, blue sky. The world was reborn in white. Vokin stood beside him, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He was still weak, but his strength was returning. He looked at Ezra and nodded, a clear indication that it was time for him to leave, to find his people. Ezra felt a strange pang of something he could not name. Reluctance? He had grown accustomed to the man's quiet presence, a buffer against the crushing loneliness. But before Vokin could make a move, a new sound broke the profound stillness. It was the crunch of boots on snow, and then harsh, rough laughter. Three men on horseback were picking their way through the drifts, drawn by the wisp of smoke from Ezra's chimney. They were hard-looking men, their faces chapped red by the wind, their eyes small and greedy. The man in the lead, a tall, rangy individual with a cruel twist to his mouth, dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership. "Well now, look what we have here," the leader said, his voice grating. "Someone cozy and warm while honest folks nearly freeze." His eyes swept over Ezra's meager farm, then flickered to the cabin door, where he saw Vokin standing just inside. His expression changed, a predatory gleam entering his eyes. "Well, well, hiding a redskin, are you, farmer?" Ezra's blood ran cold. He knew this type of man. Garrett Vance was his name, a claim jumper and sometime bounty hunter, whose reputation for casual brutality was well known in the nearest town. "He's just a traveler, caught in the storm," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. He positioned himself squarely in the doorway, blocking their view. Vance chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "A traveler? That's a funny word for it. There's a bounty on any Cheyenne buck caught off their reservation land. $5. Not much, but enough for a bottle and a warm meal." He gestured to his companions. "Hand him over. We're cold and hungry, and we ain't in a mood to argue." The moment hung in the crystalline air, sharp and fragile. Everything in Ezra's past this fear, his ingrained prejudice, his desire to be left alone, told him to step aside. It was the easy path, the safe one. Hand over the stranger, and these men would likely take some food and leave. It was a simple transaction of survival. But then he thought of the shared silence, the quiet understanding in Vokin's eyes, the hand on his shoulder, the small carved wolf on his mantle. He thought of the debt he now felt, not of obligation, but of shared humanity. He had shared his fire with this man. He had seen his dignity. He could not now sell him for $5. Ezra's resolve hardened, solidifying into something he had not felt in over a year: purpose. He looked Vance straight in the eye, his own gaze as cold and unyielding as the winter landscape. "No," he said, the single word clear and final. Vance's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of angry disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no," Ezra repeated, his voice gaining strength. "He was freezing to death. He's under my roof and under my protection. You'll not lay a hand on him." The air crackled with tension. Vance's two companions shifted uneasily on their horses, their hands moving toward their sidearms. Inside the cabin, Ezra heard a faint metallic sound. He knew without looking that Vokin had armed himself with the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He was not alone in this. "You'd choose a savage over your own kind," Vance sneered, his face contorting with rage and contempt. "You must be crazy, farmer. Or maybe you just need to be taught a lesson about hospitality. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. Last chance, step aside. Ezra didn't move. Instead, he slowly backed into the cabin and reached for the rifle he had left, propped against the wall. The action was his answer. Vance roared in frustration and surged forward, his men dismounting to follow. Get him! Burn the whole damn place down if you have to. The world erupted into chaos. Ezra slammed the heavy plank door shut just as the first man crashed against it. He fumbled with the bar, dropping it into its iron brackets, seconds before a bullet splintered the wood near his head. He scrambled away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Vokin was a shadow of motion on the other side of the room, the iron poker held like a war club, his eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to banish all trace of his former weakness. Another shot tore through the window, shattering the precious glass pane and letting in a blast of frigid air. "Come on out, farmer." Vance's voice was a venomous taunt. "Don't make us come in there." Ezra knew they couldn't hold them off for long. The cabin was a tinderbox, and the men outside were desperate and cruel. He looked at Vokin. A silent understanding passed between them. They could not win a siege. They had to fight. He pointed to the back wall, where a smaller, shuttered window looked out toward the barn. It was their only chance. As the men outside began to batter the main door with a heavy log, Ezra worked frantically at the frozen latch of the rear shutter. It finally gave way with a groan. "Go," he hissed at Vokin, gesturing toward the opening. Vokin hesitated, his gaze fixed on Ezra. He was not a man to run from a fight, especially one being fought on his behalf. "Go," Ezra repeated, more forcefully. "Find your people. I can hold them." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was the only play they had. With a final, intense look that conveyed a world of gratitude and regret, Vokin slipped through the narrow window and disappeared into the snowdrifts behind the cabin. Just as he vanished, the main door splintered and burst inward. Vance and his two cronies spilled into the room, their faces ugly with triumph. Ezra didn't hesitate. He brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired, not to kill but to maim. The shot caught one of the men in the leg, and he went down with a howl of pain. The enclosed space filled with the deafening roar and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Before the others could recover from the shock, Ezra lunged, using the rifle like a club, catching the second man across the face. But Vance was too quick. He sidestepped Ezra's clumsy attack and brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on Ezra's arm. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through him, and the rifle clattered to the floor. Vance kicked it away and raised his pistol, a victorious snarl on his face. "You stupid, sentimental fool," he spat. It was then that the rear shutter burst open again. Vohkinne exploded back into the room, not running away, but attacking. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking. He had circled around. He swung the heavy iron poker in a vicious arc, catching Vance squarely in the wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol flew from his grasp. Vance screamed in agony, clutching his shattered hand. The fight was short and brutal. Together, Ezra and Vokin were more than a match for the remaining conscious man. They drove him back out the door, and he scrambled after his wounded companions, who were already retreating in a panic. Vance, cradling his ruined arm, shot one last look of pure hatred at Ezra. "This isn't over, Blackwood. I'll come back with more men. I'll see you burn." Then he stumbled away, following his men into the blinding white snowscape. The silence that fell in the aftermath was profound. The cabin was a wreck. The door was splintered, the window shattered, and blood stained the floorboards. Ezra leaned against the wall, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and pain. His arm was bleeding freely from a deep gash where Vance had struck him. Vokin came to him. The fire was back in his eyes, but it was tempered now with concern. He gently took Ezra's injured arm and examined the wound. He tore a strip of cloth from one of Ezra's own shirts and, with surprising gentleness, cleaned and bound the gash tightly. Their roles were reversed. Now he was the caretaker. When he was done, they stood in the wreckage of the cabin, the cold wind whistling through the broken window. The animosity, the suspicion, it was all gone, burned away in the crucible of conflict. It was replaced by something solid and real, a bond forged not in words, but in shared risk and mutual defense. Vokin knew he could not stay. Vance's threat was real, and his own people would be frantic with worry. He walked to the door and looked out at the vast expanse of snow, then turned back to Ezra. He stepped forward and placed his palm flat against his own chest, over his heart. Then he reached out and placed the same hand over Ezra's heart. His dark eyes held Ezra's, and in their depths was a promise, a debt of honor acknowledged, a profound and deeply felt gratitude that needed no language. With a final nod, he turned and walked out of the cabin. He did not look back. He moved with a steady, purposeful stride, a lone figure merging with the immense, silent white, until he was gone. Ezra stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold air on his face feeling like a clarifying slap. He was alone again. The cabin was a mess, his arm throbbed with pain, and a dangerous enemy had sworn revenge. By all accounts, his situation was worse than it had been before the storm. And yet, he did not feel despair. The oppressive weight of his grief had lifted, not gone, but shifted. The house no longer felt like a tomb. The silence was not the silence of absence, but the quiet of contemplation. He had been tested, and he had not been found wanting. He had chosen connection over isolation, compassion over prejudice. For the first time since he had laid Abigail and Samuel to rest, Ezra Blackwood felt a flicker, small but persistent, of hope. He went back inside, picked up the carved wolf, and set about putting his home back in order. The following day dawned bright and cold. Every sound made Ezra jump, his senses on high alert for any sign of Vance's return. He spent the morning reinforcing the broken door and boarding up the shattered window, his rifle always within arm's reach. The world felt dangerous, but he felt alive in it, a feeling so foreign it was almost jarring. He was a man with something to defend again, even if it was only himself and the principle he had stumbled into. It was just past midday when he saw the movement on the horizon. His heart leaped into his throat. It was not the 2 or 3 men he expected. It was a long, dark line of figures on horseback, moving steadily across the snow-covered plains toward his homestead. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, a war party. His first thought was that Vokin had been unable to stop them, or that this was a different band, drawn by the scent of conflict. Or worse, that Vance had somehow fallen in with a much larger, more dangerous group. He felt a moment of pure, cold dread. He had survived so much, only to be wiped away by a tide he could not possibly fight. He stood his ground in front of his cabin, rifle in hand, a lone, defiant figure against the vastness of the plains and the approaching host. He would not hide. He would face what was coming on his feet. As the riders drew closer, he could make out their features, their clothing, the markings on their ponies. They were Cheyenne, and at their head, riding a powerful paint horse, was Vokin. He was transformed. He was no longer the storm-battered refugee Ezra had dragged from a snowdrift. He wore a magnificent war bonnet of eagle feathers that trailed down his back, his chest adorned with a breastplate of polished bone. He carried a shield and a lance. He rode with the innate authority of a leader, a man of great importance among his people. Beside him rode an older man, his face a mask of weathered dignity, whose presence commanded an even deeper respect. The 300 warriors behind them were a silent, formidable sea of strength. Ezra's heart hammered in his chest, no longer with fear, but with a profound, overwhelming awe. He lowered his rifle. Vokin rode forward, halting his horse a few feet from Ezra. The rest of the party stopped behind him, watching with unreadable expressions. A younger warrior, who rode just behind Vokin, nudged his horse forward. "He is Vokin, a war chief of the dog soldiers," the young man said in clear, if heavily accented, English. "He was a translator. He has told our council of what you did." How you took him from the storm when his spirit was about to leave his body. How you shared your fire and your food. How you stood against the men who came to do him harm and bled for him. Vokin spoke in his own language, his voice resonant and powerful, and the young man translated. He says, "You showed a brave heart and an honorable spirit. You did not see a Cheyenne, you saw a man. For this, his debt to you is a debt of our people." The elder chief, the great leader of their band, urged his horse forward. He spoke, his voice like the rumbling of distant thunder, and the young man translated again. "Our scouts found the men who troubled you. They will not trouble this land or anyone else again. Their journey is over." The finality in his tone left no room for doubt about the fate of Garrett Vance and his companions. Then, at a gesture from the chief, several warriors came forward leading pack horses. They were laden with gifts. They piled thick, rich buffalo robes and beaver pelts at Ezra's feet. They laid down great slabs of smoked and cured meat, more than he could eat in a year. They presented him with 2 fine, strong ponies, their breath pluming in the cold air. It was a fortune, a king's ransom on the frontier. Ezra was speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the gesture. I cannot accept all this," he stammered. "I did only what any man should do." Vokin spoke again, a softer tone this time, and the translator smiled faintly. He says, "You did what few men would. These are not payment, they are gifts of honor, from a friend to a friend." He says, "This small farm of yours," the young man swept a hand to encompass Ezra's land, "will now be known to our people as a place of peace. You are Ezra Blackwood, the man with the open door. Our hunting parties will know these boundaries. They will protect them as their own. You will not be lonely here." Vokin dismounted. He walked to Ezra and looked at the boarded-up window and the splintered door. He touched the rough wood of the doorframe, then looked at Ezra's bandaged arm. He said nothing, but his eyes conveyed a deep personal respect. He clasped Ezra's good arm, a warrior's grip, firm and solid. Then he mounted his horse, raised a hand in salute, and rejoined the line of warriors. With a single, unified movement, the entire party turned and began to ride away, their forms stark against the endless white. Ezra stood and watched them go, a solitary farmer surrounded by a wealth of furs and meat, with 2 new horses nudging his shoulder curiously. He watched until the last rider had disappeared over the horizon, leaving him once more in the profound silence of the plains. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, but it was a different cold now. It was just weather. The ice around his heart had been broken. He looked at the 2 small wooden crosses on the hill, and for the first time the sight did not bring a fresh wave of incapacitating pain. The grief was there, a dull and permanent ache, but it was no longer the only thing. It was now part of a larger story, one that included a blizzard, a desperate fight, and the astonishing arrival of friendship from the most unexpected corner of the world. He slowly walked back into his cabin. The air was frigid from the broken window, but the hearth was warm. His gaze fell to the mantelpiece. Samuel's lopsided bird and Vokin's howling wolf stood side by side, 2 small pieces of carved wood that told the story of all he had lost and everything he had just found. The land was still harsh, the winters still long, but Ezra Blackwood was no longer simply surviving. He was beginning to live again, a man who had shared his fire with an enemy and found a brother, a man who had discovered that the truest measure of a home was not its walls, but the reach of its heart.